Good day, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I am Danica Guzny, the Vice President of Research Grants and Scholarships at the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. And it is a pleasure to be with you today to moderate this panel organized by in partnership with the Council of Canadian Academies. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Comme nos panélistes viennent d'un peu partout dans le monde, les discussions se tiendront surtout en anglais. Je vous invite toutefois à formuler vos questions en langue officielle de votre choix. This panel was inspired by the expert panel report from the Council of Canadian Academies entitled Powering Discovery, which describes many promising international practices for funding the natural sciences and engineering, from innovations in program design and delivery to shaping research practices and norms. This report was sponsored by NSERC, and it has been instrumental for the development of NSERC's next strategic. As part of our Phase 2 strategic planning process, NSERC has published this week a series of 12 discussion papers on important topics for the future of natural sciences and engineering research funding in Canada. We encourage you to consult the webpage for NSERC 2030 to read through these papers and to share your feedback and ideas. Today, I have the privilege to be joined by 3 international experts to examine how research funders are using experimentation to test new funding practices that leverage their limited resources more strategically, effectively, and equitably. We will also discuss how these practices can foster a more diverse and resilient scientific workforce, how they can better support research excellence in all its forms across disciplines and career stages, and how they help funders be more responsive to changing social and scientific landscapes. Our first panelist is Dr. Shirley Tillman, President Emeritus and Professor of Molecular Biology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She joins us as the chair of the expert panel on international practices for funding natural science and engineering research, and will set the stage for our discussion by providing an overview of the findings published earlier this year in the Powering Discovery report. Dr. Tillman, over to you.
Thank you, Danica, very much. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you today to be able to talk about the Powering Discovery report, which, as Danica said, was commissioned by NSERC, and where an international panel was asked to review the kinds of funding practices that exist around the globe, as well as focus in on some of the more experimental ideas that were being discussed by people in funding agencies. If I could have the next slide. The panel was an international one from the United States, from the UK, from Japan, and from France and the EU, as well as having, of course, important representation from 3 Canadian scientists. This study was conducted entirely during the pandemic. And I think it's worth saying a few words about the sense of a changing landscape for natural science and engineering funding around the globe. And many of the features that are illustrated on this slide were discussed as we talked to people from all over the planet. The first is some of the experimentation that we heard about is absolutely being driven by a sense that there is a growing hyper competition for funding, and this is putting enormous pressure on researchers. It's also putting enormous pressure on funding agencies. The second thing we detected in many of our conversations was a blurring of funding models. So the old models of having either individual grants or block grants to institutions, that distinction, which may have existed 20 years ago, is now being blurred. And so agencies are trying many different sort of variations on the theme of how to fund natural sciences and engineering, and some are we found quite interesting. The third thing is that all of the funding agencies that we communicated with are reporting that they are being asked to promote uh, social goods in addition to ensuring that they are funding excellent science. And this would include, of course, important areas around diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. But it also included things like uh, how bioethical issues, and funding agencies were increasingly being asked to play an important role in adjudicating some of these really important social issues. And finally, of course, everything was, there was a pall being cast in our conversations because we were in the middle of the pandemic. But as I think this panel will discuss, the pandemic also gave us an opportunity to do some new things as well. So that's the first sort of general comment I want to make. The second one is relevant, I think, to James Wilston's presentation in a few minutes. And that is, although we heard about lots of interesting ideas about how to improve the funding of science and engineering, uh, um, we we saw very little evidence that some of these experimental ideas were being evaluated rigorously and effectively, as you would expect scientists to be determined to do. So this meant that we could certainly report the experiments, but we could not report whether these experiments were being successful or not. And I think the next stage of this project is going to have to be determining new ways of evaluating how new experimental practices, whether they are successful or not. So the report had 7 chapters, but I'm going to really focus on the core of the report, which are the 3 middle chapters where we looked at mechanisms for supporting researchers, mechanisms for supporting interdisciplinary, high risk and responsive research, and finally, how to enhance the efficiency and the impact of science funding. Next slide. So some of the successful and promising practices for supporting researchers, um, uh, the first category is kind of supporting research at all career stages. And I'm not going to say a great deal more about this, although it was one of the most promising and interesting innovations that we saw, because Ariane Steenbroeken, who's the next speaker, is going to talk about the experience in the Dutch Research Council in creating segmenting awards for career stages. Rather than having junior people having to compete with very senior people all in the same competition. Clearly, bridge funding became an important issue, particularly around COVID, because of the problems of having to reduce research output during the pandemic. Most agencies that we spoke to are looking for new ways to cultivate equity, diversion, and inclusion, EDI. Some of the most successful examples of this we saw, for example, in the UK, the Athena Swan process, which has been replicated in many other places, as well as setting diversity targets for some grants that are particularly important to increase diversity and inclusion, and fellowships that are specifically targeted at disadvantaged groups. And finally, in the countries where, like Canada, where there is a significant Indigenous population that has been disadvantaged over a long period of time, we heard about programs that were specifically designed to encourage research in those communities. Next slide. So this is, and again, I'm not going to say very much more about this, except the Dutch Research Council, as well as the European Research Council, have created these segmented career stage awards that we see having many positive advantages. It certainly helps young people get their careers underway, but it's also, I think, in the case of the ERC, is being very helpful to mid-career people who are often lost in the effort to support young investigators. And finally, it allows a funding agency to ensure that there is really a robust workforce and pipeline for that workforce. So I'm going to let Arian tell you more about those. Next slide. There were a lot of interesting ideas around how to do peer review more effectively, more efficiently, and more fairly. And probably the motivation in a lot of the places that were looking at this were motivated by a great desire to ensure that bias is reduced in peer review. And again, James Wilston is going to talk about double-blind applications and partial lotteries, which were ideas that were being tested at the organizations that you can see here in this slide, as well as distributed review, which was to ask the applicant pool to review each other's grants, which we thought was a very novel idea, but for which there is very little evidence yet that it produces a more fair and impactful outcome. Next slide. Clearly, there is no agency that is not trying to ensure that they are doing high risk, high reward science, that they are resisting the conservatism that is often accompanies peer review in times when funds are limited. So we took a long look at practices there. On the next slide. Here are just some of the ideas that were being considered. One is the importance, if you're going to do high risk research, of having grants of longer duration, building in some flexibility so that when a result produces a change in direction, that is allowed within the funding agency's purview. We also looked at interdisciplinary research and the problems that often accompany being able to review interdisciplinary research effectively, ways in which to do that more effectively. But clearly, all agencies are interested in experimenting with how to do this. Next slide. And finally, as I mentioned a minute ago, all of the agencies are concerned about the administrative burden that is placed on them in this hyper-competitive environment, being asked to review more and more and more applications. So this was an area of great interest to the agencies we spoke with. And on the next slide. And we've already touched on some of the ideas that are out there, pre-screening applications, allowing for very short pre-submissions, followed by either a distributed review or in some cases lotteries, partial lotteries of a select pool. There's also a lot of attention now, as all of us know through DORA, for example, of the importance of open access principles, of actually mandating them for grantees, and asking that grantees pay more attention to public outreach and education, and concerns about whether basic fundamental research is being harmed by having requirements for us having societal impact, and hoping that the definitions of that can be as broad as possible. And then the improving the evaluation we've already to a certain extent touched on, and James Wilston is going to talk about this more, so I'm not going to say more about that. So last slide. This is the report, and there's the website where you can download it. And I hope you will find it interesting. And so I'm going to conclude there, Danica, and turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. I encourage everyone to read the report. I think it was a fascinating and very informative report. There are a lot of interesting topics here that we can dive into throughout the panel discussion, and I'm sure that your presentation will inspire many excellent questions from the audience. So this leads well into our next presentation. Supporting researchers across all career stages is priority for funders worldwide, and it is one of the central topics of discussion in NSERC's strategic planning process. The NWO has been a trailblazer in this area through its talent program established 20 years ago. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Arjen Steenbruggen, Director of Domain Science for the Dutch Research Council, who joins us to share lessons learned from this program. Dr. Steenbruggen, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Danica, and thank you for the invitation to do so. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Dutch talent scheme, and yeah, in the Netherlands a little bit of a history as well. In the Netherlands, about 10% of the total flow of funds from the Ministry of Education and Science to the universities for scientific research goes through the Dutch Research Council, NWO. And so NWO selects the most excellent research and competition. And this relatively small fraction of this budget has a major influence on the rest of the budget, on the other 90%. And scientific research follows the path of the most excellent and well-organized researchers and research groups. That's what you know. That's science. That is what research policy in its entirety is. So that's exactly what we're talking about here, how to have as much impact as possible with the limited budget. And NWO has a few well-organized funding schemes, open competition, infrastructure, Dutch science agenda, that's more science for society, and the talent scheme. And the talent scheme was set up more than 20 years ago and is very successful. Of course, it has also gone through some developments over time, and I will explain it later. It now also needs some adjustments. And the talent program offers personal grants to talented creative researchers. This enables them to conduct the research of their choice in their different stages. And the talent scheme has three funding instruments. It's the Veni Vidi Vici, and we have also a Rubicon that's even before they are in that stadium of their career. And so research is you can see it in this table. Research can can apply for a Rubicon in the first year after the PhD, and for the possibility to go abroad for a position for 1 to 2 years. And then we have the Veni, Vidi, and the Vici, and that's in the different stages of their career. The Veni is for within 3 years after PhD. It's only for their own salary. The Vidi is within 8 years after their PhDs, and it is for to start with a group, 1 to 3 PhD postdoc positions, and for 5 years. And the Vici is the biggest grant. It's for within 15 years after the PhD, and for larger groups, so 3 to 5 PhD positions, and it's dealing about €1.5 million. And the main goal was to attract and to keep talent, in the universities. And it's a very prestigious and national grant. It has a very strong brand. It is really successful. And it was also, so 20 years ago, there was not a ERC scheme, the Starting Consolidator Advanced Scheme. So it was also its inspiration for that European the ERC scheme. But nowadays, so the budget in the ERC was growing and growing. It's very big now. So nowadays it's more or less a good preparation for an ERC application. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So it's very successful and it's very popular. But however, there are also some shadow sides of it. It's also maybe a little bit too popular. The success rate decreased. It's only 10 to 15% Fiji, for example, in the social science and humanities domain. In the science domain, it's around 20%, and whereas it was meant to keep talent at the university, so that when a university thinks, oh, this is a real talent, we offer them the possibility to send in an application for the Veni Vidi Vici. It's now a little bit the other way around. So the universities have a little bit it's more practice now that the universities think, well, you can have it. They tell their scientists, you can apply for a Veni Vidi Vici, and when you're successful, you can have a contract or a tenure track or a past contract there. So it started to be a little bit around. Of course, it has also to do with pressure on universities and on lower money, more researchers. And there is an overlap with the comparable ERC scheme. So there's a little bit of double dipping. So what we are working now at is that maybe it would be better to be in the different parts of the scheme, so that it's that within the scheme you fill in the gaps. And it helps the people from the Vernieuwingsimpuls to be successful in the ERC scheme. And in the past, there was too much focused on more one-dimensional definition of excellence, on high impact papers. So we're changing that with open science and with the DORA as well. And what we also see, there is an effect of the haves and the have-nots. That's the Matthew effect. So at the beginning is a maybe almost no or a little bit difference between two researchers, and the one is they are both excellent, but the one is having a grant and the other not, and then you got a very big difference. Okay, next slide. Yeah. So in the last few years, we are a little bit practicing with adapting the talent scheme. So we introduced pre-application in the Veni, a narrative CV, DORA proof, and a list of a max of 10 outputs with narrative. Why these had impact. So, and at this very moment, so in this coming month, we introduce a narrative CV as pre-application in all schemes. We have a consultation for that. And we are also working towards reducing of overlap between ERC and the talent scheme. And we introduce more domain-specific freedom in the schemes and more room for team science, and more money towards talent scheme or more money to IDs scheme. The next slide, please. Yeah. So okay. Yeah, this is the thank you. Yeah. So it's the conclusion is that the Dutch talent scheme is highly effective in attracting talent and providing scientific freedom to our most talented researchers. So it's a very big success, and it's highly valued by our research community, and yeah, of course, especially by the laureates. And yeah, we now practice them with adapting the scheme to towards the open science, DORA, team science, decreasing success rates. So we have a lot of things to work on now to leave it to be as successful as it was. And so we will continue with it. We will continue with this career scheme, but it's also time for some changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I find to hear how this kind of program can evolve over time. You know, you've been doing it for 20 years, and in particular to align with the international best practices for responsible research assessment, like DORA, as we've been talking about. and NSERC and the other Canadian federal granting agencies have recently signed on to DORA as well. So we are also examining similar questions. Okay. Our third and final speaker is James Wilson, Director of Research on Research Institute, Rory, and Digital Professor of Research Policy at the Information School of Sheffield. Rory conducts very impressive work by assembling funding agency partners from around the world, including the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research here in Canada. James, last year, NSERC hosted a CSPC panel with your colleague, Stephen Pinfield, who gave us a preview of Rory's projects on understanding how funders use, define, and apply the concept of excellence, on criteria used in research processes, and on new funding mechanisms like partial lotteries, among other very interesting initiatives. So with that, Dr. Wilson, I will turn the floor to you to describe some of these exciting results.
Great, thank you very much, Danica. Thanks for the invitation to be here and to join the discussion. And I should say, perhaps before sort of kicking off with my slides, that I thought the CCA NSERC report was really a superb contribution. I know I and others working in the Research on Research Institute have found it a very, very valuable piece of work. So congratulations to all involved. And I hope, as has already been said, that we can find ways to collectively build on all of that. So I think what I'm going to say will complement what we've heard already. Hopefully my slides are coming through. I'm just going to say a little bit about some of the work we've been involved in, as Danica's hinted at, through Rory, the Research on Research Institute. A bit of an update on work in progress, a sort of preview of some things to come, and just some broader thoughts really on where we're at in this journey, because I think it is best thought of as a journey towards more experimental and evidence-informed funding and decision making around research. So you've heard already a little bit about what Rory does. It's a relatively young venture. We were set up a couple of years ago, initially by the Wellcome Trust in the UK, together with two universities, Leiden and Sheffield, and the data company Digital Science. And we've built around that core this fantastic group of funders who are all in one way or another engaged in and at the forefront of trying out new techniques and approaches to research on research, meta science, meta research, call it what you will. I won't get into the semantics of those definitions tonight. But you sort of see a bit of the range. I mean, we've got more partners in Europe, I guess, than anywhere, but we have got, as has been mentioned, a fantastic partnership with CIHR, with Michael Smith Foundation, and I hope over time with others in the Canadian system. When we set up the sort of whole model of Rory, I mean, it's not like a sort of classic university research institute. It's a very co-productive, collaborative venture with these partners. And so when we started 2 years ago, we began by asking the funders, the partners, what they were most preoccupied with, the things that they were grappling with, and through that produced this great long list of projects and possibilities, a sort of 30-year work program. And then together as a group, we whittled that down and sort of honed and fine-tuned and came up with this first set of projects, which I won't talk about now because of time. But the last of these, as you'll see, is on randomization and, in a broader sense, experimentation in funding systems. So it's that I'll focus on. We were interested in doing this, has already been said, because we could see a number of funders globally trying this out in various ways. Still quite a small group actually doing it, but lots of interest in the wider funding community. And of course, periodically academic studies as well popping up to say that this would be a good idea, or using model-based analysis to explore what it would look like to introduce elements of randomization into the grant funding system. So we were keen to try and see whether it was possible to draw some broader, more synthetic conclusions from the let's say the relatively small number of trials that were underway, and to build from those towards this more ambitious agenda of funder experimentation. So that is what we have been trying to do. And we were lucky that in our consortium, the partners I already mentioned, we had several of those funders who have been in the sort of pioneering wave of those willing to actually try this stuff out, including the Volkswagen Foundation in Germany, who began back in 2017 what they call their Experiment Initiative, a 5-year program. So it's coming to an end now. They'll be publishing sort of final results over the next few months. A very well designed. There's loads of information on the Volkswagen process on their website, so I won't attempt to summarize it in 30 seconds. But a sort of very kind of carefully modulated, thoughtful approach to the introduction of randomization, I should say. I mean, that applies to all of these three, actually. But Volkswagen perhaps was at the forefront. The other funder that was really in the first wave of this was the Health Research Council in New Zealand, who aren't a Rory partner, but with whom we have been working in a looser way on these issues and this project. But the other two that are in the group are the Swiss National Science Foundation, who began 3 years ago now to try out elements of randomization in a couple of their grant schemes. So quite as a small scale trial in the first place. That first trial's been completed, and they're now about to embark on the next wave, and they're sort of expanding as they go their ambition, as it were, for not only randomization but for some other more experimental approaches. Matthias Egger, the president of the Swiss National Science Foundation, is a fantastic champion and ambassador for this agenda in the funding community, and has been a great collaborator for us and with other colleagues at SNSF. And then the third one I was just going to mention here is FWF. This is the National Funding Agency of Austria. And they now, I suppose 18 months ago it is, initiated this new funding scheme, the 1,000 Ideas Programme, which is a relatively small scale grant scheme that is designed, as the slide here suggests, to support very novel sort of breakthrough, I suppose, high-risk research ideas in various ways. And they, from the start, brought a randomization element into that. So they are still at an early stage in terms of evaluating the effects of that. And I should say the only disadvantage, I mean, it's great that they've done this, I applaud them for doing so. The only disadvantage, of course, if you introduce randomization into a new scheme, is that you don't really have any baseline against which to compare ways in which the introduction of randomization has changed what happened before. But nonetheless, it's still very interesting to see the effects and the application of this in practice. So these are three that are doing it. We've got several others in the consortium who are on the cusp of announcing such trials in the next few months. I won't steal their thunder by doing it now here, but suffice to say, there's definitely more to come, and I hope obviously more to come as well within the Canadian system. When we're looking at all of this, what are the sorts of questions we're trying to ask if we're doing meta research, we're doing research on these sorts of experiments? There are lots of things in the mix. A sort of prior question to these even is this issue around baselines, which I've touched on, but I'll park that to one side. When you're actually then analysing the experiments, there are at least 5 interesting avenues of inquiry. A big set of questions around bias, equality, diversity, inclusion, and for many of those who are engaging in this stuff, that's a big driver for why they're doing it. They want to see whether the introduction of partial randomization can counter various forms of largely implicit or sort of systemic bias in various ways. There's always a debate about burden and bureaucracy, whether this stuff can reduce the burden either on the applicant or on the funding agency. I think the evidence for that, at least as we've seen it, is fairly weak, in that to design and introduce these schemes well is actually fairly complex. And linking to the fourth point, if I can skip in a non-linear way through this list, around legitimacy, there are also often quite big stakeholder perception management challenges in doing this, in that you can obviously envisage how some audiences, media, political, even in the science community, may seize upon the introduction of random lottery elements as the subject of some contestation and debate, and so sort of managing that is quite a challenge and adds to the burden. Nonetheless, it is interesting to think about this, and I mean there are of course ways in terms of structuring the funding process that could at least reduce some of the burden on the applicant. I think it's less so for the agency. Risk I've already touched on in the context of the FWF experiment, but we see a number of funders interested in use of these techniques in so-called high-risk areas of research, on the basis that conventional modes of assessment are perhaps less well suited to funding that sort of work. Legitimacy I've mentioned. Outcomes, of course, is the ultimate question. Does random allocation ultimately result in projects with different or better impacts and outcomes? And I think there we have no evidence at all, because no one's been doing this for long enough to know. So I think that's an important topic, and something that will require long-term patient research, which I'll perhaps touch on at the end of what I'm going to say. So that's what we've been kind of doing. We did some initial scoping work. There's a paper on our website you can get, which sort of scopes the terrain. And we had a workshop last year, but in a sense, that's all about to be updated with a further workshop, which is happening next week, 1st of December, to which you're all very welcome. It's an online event. It was going to be hybrid, but we've, I suppose, sensibly, in light of fresh COVID waves across Europe, decided to move it fully online. 1st of December, and at that event, we will be presenting our thoughts on lessons across these different experiments. We'll be launching this thing you can see on the right here, the Experimental Research Funders Handbook, which is an initial attempt to distill insights from the different experiments that are underway, and to offer a sort of guide for other funders who want to venture down this path. And we're also going to hear updates from several of the funders who are doing this stuff, including all those I've just mentioned: Volkswagen, Health Research Council New Zealand, FWF, and SNSF. So if you are interested, the time zone, I must confess, is not fantastic for a Canadian audience. It's 9:30 a.m. Central European time, but we will be putting a video of it all up online as well. So hopefully, one way or another, if you're interested, you can see it. But just to now pull back and talk a bit more reflectively, I know I've got 90 seconds left probably, but I think in this whole debate, we have been talking about the need for this stuff for a very long time. I mean, I've been in science policy actively for about 20 years. There was a very big, important contribution that many of you, I'm sure, will recall back in 2005. Jack Marburger, who was then the White House science advisor under Bush, second Bush, gave this fantastic speech, and really quite bold speech, to the AAAS, calling for a much more rigorous and robust science of doing science, to interrogate the sort of assumptions, claims that were made around science and innovation funding. And that, of course, in turn triggered the launch of the US National Science Foundation SciSIP program, as it was then called, Science of Science Innovation Policy. It's now been renamed the Science of Science program. And parallel debates were going on in Europe. Around that time, I was director of policy for the UK's National Academy, the Royal Society, and we did a big study in 2010, you can see here, called Scientific Century, which was partly oriented towards shoring up the science budget in a post-austerity, British political context, but also made a very strong plea for far better systems of evidence gathering and experimentation to support the broader development of the research innovation system. So when I'm feeling depressed, I do feel at times we haven't moved as far or fast as we might have done. If one thinks that Marburger's speech was 15 years ago, that report was nearly 12 years ago now. And we do still see a lot of rediscovery of the same ground, I think is a fair way of summarizing it. There was a great speech. It was a very good speech. I commend it if you're interested in UK research policy, from Sir John Kingman, who was until very recently the chair of our national funding agency, UK Research Innovation, and was also formerly a big player in the Treasury here. And he gave this great sort of valedictory speech. And at the end, he sort of reflected in rather sort of wistful terms. If you look back on his involvement in this area, which went further than even UKRI, he was struck by how much of it tended to turn on the gut feel of the individuals involved, rather than hard evidence and analysis. And he rehearses the point, which we've already heard in this session, that of course, we more than any community should be at the forefront of testing hypotheses against data, etc. So it's great, it's brilliant to see that point being made. It would be better, of course, if he did made it in the 5 years when he was in charge of the funding agency rather than when he was leaving the building. But I think it reinforces both the importance of this and the need to really hold funders and other governments and other feet to the fire on this stuff. I mean, it's always going to be a second order priority compared to the immediate challenges of the moment, but it is so important if we're going to actually improve the efficacy of research spending and get the kind of results from research investment that we all want to see, which of course in turn will renew the case for investment. So there's lots of more work needed here. I mean, we are going in the UK obviously through lots of debates about how we organise our system at the moment. We're supposed to be becoming a science superpower. I'm not quite sure what that means or what the empirical basis of that is as a category, but we see lots of areas where there's need for more work, as I'm sure is the case in Canada and elsewhere. Across the field, there's loads going on. I mean, I would say a big difference from 2005 or 2010 is the sheer diversity of players in this space. So on top of traditional actors in academia and elsewhere, fields like STS, innovation studies, scientometrics, of course, you've got lots and lots of great stuff bubbling up from different bits of the research system. A few examples here. I think it's a very, very dynamic, exciting time to be asking these questions and involved in them. And I do think for that reason that, we can be more positive rather than negative in terms of the progress that's being made. But there's still a long way to go. We were involved in this great conference a few weeks ago, MetaScience 2021, which brought together lots of players in this space, academic funders and others. And time and again, one heard the refrain that, well, if only we could, or only if we had the support, the funding, the infrastructure, the institutional arrangements to really enable proper long-term analysis of these questions, we could do so much. And I think, we are still, notwithstanding all of that activity, seeing a field that is very fragmented, that's poorly resourced relative to its importance and the scale of what it could contribute. I think there's lots coming down the pipe. I think there's huge scope in terms of experiments to draw from very rich debates about uses of experimental methods in other fields. A few examples here. We're working with both EMBO, who've done some great work on limits of peer review, conventional peer review, with the Innovation and Growth Lab at Nesta, who have been doing great stuff on experimental methods in a whole range of settings. So I think there's lots to build on, but still, I think some way to go in embedding this in research. So I will stop there. I am positive. I'm excited about what's going on. I think there's still a lot of scope to do this stuff better, and I think to do it in a more systematic, comparative, long-term way, which is what the field really needs. Thank you.
And thank you very much, James. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to reading Rory's Experimental Research Funders Handbook when it's unveiled in a few weeks. And I believe we see that the link to the event that you were mentioning is in the chat if people are interested, with the proviso that it starts at 3:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which surprisingly works for me, but probably not a lot of other people. So I am surely not the only person who is excited to start asking questions here of this panel. At this point, I would really encourage people to enter questions in the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. While I'm waiting for that to be populated, I will start in with my questions. I will try to refrain, unless nobody submits a question, which I can't believe that would be the case. So I'll read the question and then I will randomly assign one of you to start. I think I'd like to focus on international coordination. So, work that's being done by Rory, as we've just heard about, and initiatives like the Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, are creating a real momentum where funders are sharing their experiences and lessons learned from experimentation. One of the major outcomes of the 2020 Conference on Responsible Research Assessment by the Global Research Council was a call for greater coordination of experimentation across funders globally to develop our understanding of what works and in what context. So from your perspective, can you tell us what you see as the main challenges that still need to be overcome to enable this kind of coordination? And I will start maybe with Arian first to get your thoughts, if you're okay with being first out of the gate here.
So the question is I'm sorry, but I have a bad connection, so I missed the middle of your question. Maybe you can repeat the question. Sorry.
I will pass it over to James, perhaps, to kick off. The question was around how do we get better coordination across the international research funders for experimentation? I'll give you some time to think on that, and I'll pass it over to James, because it was building off of work that Rory has done.
Sure. Thanks, Danica. Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic to see organisations like the Global Research Council really running with some of these agendas. We were, involved in some of the work that went into the conference, the recent conference and the earlier workshop on responsible research assessment, which is very much about building on things like DORA, the Leiden Manifesto, other efforts globally to and to see what more funders can do as key actors in those systems. I mean, of course, as with so many challenges in research systems, one needs all the bits of the system to sort of move at once. But funders have more influence than many, and can really push forward some of these sorts of activities. So I hope that the GRC becomes one arena in which there is more effort. We see similar collaborative work going on, for example, here in Europe. Science Europe as a group of funders has done some and is doing some great work as well in this area. When we set up, I don't want to push Rory necessarily, but I mean, when we set Rory up, it was from the perspective of bodies like Wellcome, who were involved in setting it up. It was born really from an analysis that they had done as a funder, that this field, while dynamic, energetic, while lots was going on, was still very fragmented. And I think, understandably, a lot of the work that does go on from the funder perspective tends to be relatively small scale evaluations of particular initiatives, whether it's evaluation of a particular funding scheme or evaluation of a particular cohort of projects, whatever it might be. And it's very understandable why that's the focus, because of course often one has to do that in any case to report back to governments and other stakeholders. But it does mean that the more the bigger, more connected, longer term analysis that is often required is harder to find, and it can be very difficult, I think, to take the findings of a study. I mean, if someone does a brilliant study of a, we'll take New Zealand, let's a brilliant study, as have been done, of the use of lotteries by the Health Research Council in New Zealand. That's great. It's a great scheme, great study, etc. But it's quite hard to take the findings of that work and apply it as a straightforward answer to equivalent issues that you might be grappling with in NSERC or in NWO in the Netherlands or in the Wellcome Trust or UKRI. I mean, there's obviously lots of other factors at play. There's issues of scale. There's so many things. So this is why I think, whether it through what we're doing or what others are doing, patient, longer term connected investment is really the way forward for this field of work, because it's only through that we can really properly answer the questions. It doesn't, it's not going to deliver answers overnight, and it's always easy to push this stuff down the list, as I say. But when we really need it, it's that kind of investment and involvement that can really deliver the proper, rigorous data, answers, evidence that we need. And I would also just say that, I mean, this stuff doesn't have to be very expensive. It can be done on a shoestring, really, relative to the sums of money that are at play in the wider research system. I mean, we're spending globally around $2 trillion a year on R&D, both public and private. I don't know what the total sum is for investment in sort of meta research, science of science, but it's a very, very small fraction of 1% of that. I can tell you.
Thank you so much, Arian.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm back. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. When talking about us doing research on research policy, I think it would be a very nice idea to share practices within Europe, but also around the world. So when looking at my own council, the Dutch Research Council, I also see that James showed us a slide with that quote of the UKRI person, director, we do a lot on our gut feeling and not on evidence-based. So we're trying to start it up now, also at the Dutch Research Council, that's research on research. And only for our council, it's our research in our boards and our committees prefer to do our own scheme. But when looking at the ERC, it's very important. There's a lot of money there to look at that scheme as well, and to help our researchers to be successful there as well, and not doing double dippings and the same things. And I think these best practice, we can use it around the world as well, not only in Europe, but together with Canada and so on. And we just started also to have a look at the what we call the sister organizations in Europe, the DFG, and what are you doing on the talent scheme, but also an open competition. And we are also discussing the randomization, the lotteries. It's our ministry who doesn't want that for the moment, but maybe in the future. But it's so important to share these practices, I think, and to do it, maybe in conferences like this, or let's visit each other and talk about this and share our practices, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Shirley, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add from your perspective. No. Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of questions now in the Q&A, so I will read them out and then look for volunteers. And I apologize because it's quite small on my screen, so I'm going to have to get close. Can Canadian researchers apply for NWO or other countries' funding and grants? If yes, how is the procedure? So Ariane, that's for you.
No, I'm sorry, but that's not possible. So the talent scheme for this research council, you have to be affiliated to a Dutch university. So yeah.
Very much. That's a clear answer. The second question that I see here, and apologies if I'm missing as I go along, two very loosely linked questions. One, how do or should we measure the success of different funding mechanisms? And two, should the funding mechanism vary based on who the funding would be for, i.e. whether the intent is to fund research by government scientists who usually work under programs with a specific mandate, by academia, by industry, or by other organizations? I don't know if there's someone who could maybe post that in the chat so we can read the question a little bit more. I'll start with the first one. How do or should we measure the success of different funding mechanisms? Is there anyone who would like to tackle that one?
Well, in fact, I was going to ask James exactly that question. So I'm glad the question has been posed by one of the viewers. It is the $64,000 question, which is, as I looked at your list of criteria, the one that matters in the long run is outcomes. Is the practice producing the best science? And by that, I mean science that has a long-term impact. And I think that's going to be really, really challenging to figure out how to do this effectively in a shorter time frame than the 10 to 20 years that it often takes before you know whether research has really produced the kind of impact you hope for. So how do you think about this, James?
Yeah, well, it is, as you say, it's the $64,000 question. I mean, I think you know, there are a few sort of iron laws in research policy, but I mean, one, I think, based on you know, now decades of work, is the importance of a diversity of funding modes and means, whether that needs multiple institutions or just different instruments within you know, fewer institutions is a different debate. But one definitely wants a range of means. And you know, I think, as I say, we've been doing, you know, a lot of work on partial randomization, because it's something that's, you know, a sort of hot topic. It's being tried out. It's relatively untested still. I certainly don't think it's some sort of panacea, or should be sort of rolled out, you know, wholesale across vast swathes of research funding systems for lots of very obvious reasons. You know, I think it's always going to be a you know, one element of a mix. And I mean, to focus on the British system again, for if I may, you know, we of course, in addition to whatever grant funding schemes we have, there's a heavy element of our research funding system which comes through a block grant, which is allocated on the basis of this, you know, cyclical research assessment exercise. I mean, you know, you have obviously, you know, the same, different but similar thing through you know, the SEP in the Netherlands. So you know, that's very important. The design of that instrument is hugely important, because, you know, that's the biggie, as it were, which everyone's involved in one way or another. So there's a lot of debate there. But I think, you know, other methods, I mean, you know, I've been involved at various points with things like sandpits, you know, where you take a whole group of people away, and you know, in a sense, the selection is who gets to participate, and once they're in the room, they have a sort of, you know, 1 in 2 chance of coming out with funding. So it's a very different model to you know, something like the ERC, as Ariane mentioned, where you know, you apply, but you've got a very small chance of success. So you know, we have got evidence of lots of these schemes in different contexts. Is there a definitive study that can tell us, you know, what mix to use where and how? No, because of course that's so contextually specific, and it changes over time, even in a different, you know, in a particular national system. So, but I think, you know, what we're trying, I suppose, this whole field, from funders, from governments, from academics involved in this stuff, is trying to just build up a better, richer, more robust picture of that landscape, to help funders, other decision makers decide, you know, which things to pull out, as it were, you know, in a particular context and use.
Can I just push on you a little bit on this? So let's imagine that you do the perfect randomized trial of lotteries. You have, you know, you design it in a way that it would pass your rigorous peer review. What are you going to measure? What are you going to measure to determine whether the randomization produced a better outcome? What are the metrics that you care about?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the slide I showed with the kind of different questions in the mix. So I think one feature, even among the small number of funders who are involved now in trials of randomization, you know, they're not all entering that arena, as it were, with the same motives, or with the same sort of ranking of motives, should we say. So you might be primarily concerned about questions of allocation and bias, equality, diversity within that process. So in that sense, you're not so worried about the outcome issue, although of course, as you rightly say, Shelley, ultimately that's the thing that matters. But
Right.
you can look at changes. You know, if we've got grant scheme X that we've been running for a number of years, and we've run it that way, and then we introduce partial randomization, do we see a difference in terms of distribution by you know, gender, career stage, institution? I mean, that's a massive issue, obviously, certainly in a country like my own, where you've got, you know, a lot of universities, but only a few of them that are the real sort of research elite. I mean, it's the same in most systems, of course. So there, you could test for that. Of course, the issue there is the control question, and we go back to my point about the Austrian example. The only difficulty there is you haven't got a prior history of doing it in a different way to compare. So, you know, there are really very, very few, even the really good examples, maybe Volkswagen SNSF get closest, examples of trials that really have a solid baseline in that way. So it's very, very, wobbly, as it were, if we were to kind of really push at the methods here. But there is a recognition of that, and there is a I think some of the next wave of trials and experiments we're seeing will address some of these methodological shortcomings. But then, you might then be looking, I say, at the questions of burden, if that was your concern. I say I haven't found many examples of that. You might be looking at the extent to which riskier research is being funded. However, defining that in itself is a difficult thing to measure.
Right.
So, etc. There's a range of ways of doing it, but I think we all recognize, even those of us trying to do this stuff, that what we're doing at the moment, or what has been done, is still fairly primitive in terms of its methods and the applicability of its findings. Does that mean we shouldn't sort of carry on and keep trying? I know. I think we have to keep pushing at this, and this is the challenge. We're sort of in the science of science. We're still sort of. I said I used to work at the Royal Society. I sort of think of the early years of the Royal Society, where they'd sort of sit there slicing up dogs on people's tables in coffee lounges around London. I don't think we're quite at that level of primitivity, but we aren't that far along in terms of really, really putting our money where our mouth is and applying these sorts of methods that are completely commonplace in so many areas of science to the way we run our own funding system.
Thank you very much for that. I have to say that my dog perked up when he heard your comment about slicing up dogs. So he's glad we've moved past that. Arian, anything that you'd like to add on this, or I can read a couple of comments from the discussion forum as
well. Maybe on the second part of the question from Margaret Sapowski, should the funding mechanism vary based on who, or for who the funding would be for? Well, in the Netherlands, we at the Dutch Research Council, we also have the we call it public-private science contracts. It's money from different ministry, from economical affairs, and there we have different mechanisms. So also private companies have to be involved there, and that's quite a different scheme. But within that, we're making a call for proposals, and we're doing the same thing. So that's the same mechanism, but it's different because we asked for co-funding from that private party as well, and so the success rates are a bit higher there because there are less proposals. So that is a different scheme, but maybe a different mechanism, depends on what your definition of that mechanism is. But in the end, we have a call for proposals, and we take care for selecting the excellent research out of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I found that session very interesting to follow. A couple of thoughts that have come in from the discussion and in other chats. There was a follow-up that said, to what degree do we need to make progress on developing meaningful indicators of research impacts before we can evaluate the impacts on other research funding policy? So I think that's a valid question. We don't necessarily need to discuss that right now, as there's many questions in the Q&A, but I thought I would pass that. I will move on to the next question. The question is there evidence of more current strategies of allocating research grants, for example, DORA or EDI criteria, that are encouraging the participation of more women in STEM? Who would like to handle this one first?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe when looking at it's only early days for when taking into account the DORA principles. I think for 2 years now, And we think we see a little bit difference now, but it's statistical, from a statistical point of view, it's too early days at the moment to take a conclusion out of that. I don't know what your experience is, Shirley or James, but I think there will be, yeah. But
Yes,
yeah.
sorry, I was going to reach for something behind me, but should I come in, Danica? I mean, I think you're right, Ari. I think for I mean, you know, it's brilliant that Dora. You know, I've been a long-term supporter of Dora from the off, and you know, Stephen Curry, who chairs Dora, you know, obviously is a colleague and, you know, friend of mine here, and it's brilliant now that Dora as an organisation has managed to secure more resource to build up, you know, more of the kind of research that would enable us to answer that question. I mean, one has to remember, you know, notwithstanding its impact as an initiative, you know, Dora for a long time has just been run on, you know, I mean, there's literally been one person supporting it, and then you know, a collection of well-meaning volunteers. So it's I think it's quite difficult and a bit unrealistic to expect Dora itself to monitor this stuff. I mean, of course, institutions at the end of the day, I mean, if you sign in, if you're a university, my own university, you know, has signed up to Dora, in a sense, one should be able to observe the effects at the institutional level. The same for funders who've signed on to these things, and start to see the effects of the introduction of these sorts of policies if they're being meaningfully applied, which of course is itself a big question. But I think it would be quite hard to say in aggregate terms, you know, this is the effect of something like Dora, although I have little doubt that in overall terms, the effect has been positive. The thing I was going to reach for behind me, you will see a poster of it. It's a corner of my back of my bookshelf there, the metric tide. We did in a similar vein in 2014-15, I chaired a review for the UK government of the use of metrics in the UK system. Which actually drew also on another very good CCA report that was produced a couple of years before that. And with that, definitely we can't. I mean, you know, that was about the ref, and should we switch the whole UK ref to metrics only? So I suppose in crude terms, the fact that we didn't do that and we went for a different system, one can see a genuine palpable effect of these initiatives on an active, ongoing funding stream, although I wouldn't chalk it all up to my review. So yeah, there is building evidence, but I mean, it goes back. I'm sorry, this becomes a bit of a broken record. In so many of these areas, we just haven't got, you know, the longer term patient effort to properly understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the only thing I would add, Danica, is one is the sort of Dora related, which I'm very much in favor of what Arian indicated the NWO is planning to do with using narrative CVs. I think that is going to be very beneficial to people who are underrepresented in science. And the other is the obvious, which is the way you select your peer review panels will have an impact on whether they are paying attention and giving women's applications the same serious review that they give male applications. I mean, that's been proven time and time and time again, that if you have women on the peer review panels, you are more likely to get a more balanced outcome.
Agreed. And we've sat on peer review panels together, and I know from firsthand experience that to be the case. Eric, follow up?
Sorry, I would like to add something to that, because also the use of that, I also very much believe in that narrative CV, and I think in the end it will be successful, but it's a bumpy road because applicants, but also committee members, panel members have really difficulties in that. We are using it now for 1.5 years. And can't we use? Are we not allowed to use age indexes anymore? And how? But how do we measure it then? And it's okay, but in the end it will be all right. But it's not easy at the moment for us. It's a lot of comments towards us, our board, our people, why using this narrative CV is very, very complicated. Yeah.
I understand, but unless we do that, we're ceding peer review to the journals.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I'm not sure that's what NSERC wants to do, right, Danica?
Yeah.
I agree, and I'm not noting the change in the CV. We could go into the Canadian Commons CV. That would be a very long discussion. I don't think this is the right forum, but I agree that the CV is very important, and how we format it and structure it is as important as the information that's on it, I think, when it comes to the peer review. Moving on, there's one question here that I actually had myself, so I am going to prioritize it. It's a question, or looking for advice, I guess, on how funding agencies can set themselves up to better evaluate experimentation to build up that evidence base that we're lacking right now. So, internal to NSERC or CIHR or SSHRC or the other funders, how can we build up this expertise so that we do the experimentation and the evaluation properly? And James, I think I will pick on you to start this one with your expertise.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think here we do see some, more innovative approaches being adopted by some funders. I'm going to single out Wellcome Trust, partly because I know them well, partly because we work with them on this, and I know they do a lot of it. But they, about 3-4 years ago now, invested quite heavily in an in-house data team. So sort of building, I guess, out from conventional evaluation type teams to really try and draw in more of the emerging, quantitative analytic capability that one could see out there in the wider system, and which of course is being, developed and offered through various more commercial platforms, but to try and build that capability in-house. So I think that's one way. And then to connect that, to other data sources, external data sources, etc. So in a sense, you then create an alternative. With this conversation we're touching on there around, seeding, the measurement of what's good and bad to the publishing system, I think I would agree is hugely problematic. But that's not to say there isn't value in some of those metrics if used appropriately and contextually and with care. But it's very good also to be developing your own data sources, or at least building up better systems for tracking and capturing data internally, and then I think supplementing it also with qualitative methods as well. I mean, I do think for a lot of the impact stuff, while it's great to see continued efforts and experimentation in the development of impact indicators, touched on in an earlier comment, we are still really, flying quite blind on a lot of that stuff in the quantitative realm, and that's why we time and again come back to the value of narrative. And I don't think that's someone's still seen as a sort of failure. We've somehow conceding, oh god, we've got to write it down. Then I don't see it like that at all. I mean, I think particularly in the political realm, narrative is a very, very powerful device, and understanding it again in a more rigorous and robust way, the power of stories, the power of good narrative, and of mixing good narrative with good indicators. That's, to my mind, the kind of plural mixed method direction we want to go in. So I think that there's lots of great stuff going on in the funding community, and I think it's a great time to be sort of pursuing this stuff in the funding. The final thing I'd just say is I think it is difficult though sometimes to, and I completely sympathise with funders on this. Part of doing this and doing it well, it links, I think, one of the comments in the chat saying, well, funders too often black box this stuff. It's completely understandable when governments are breathing down your neck and threatening to cut the research budget every 10 minutes. As a funding agency, particularly a public funding agency, you've got to be quite brave and have a very supportive political or policy climate in which to undertake forms of experimentation that might highlight things that you're not doing brilliantly or which aren't going as well as they might, for very obvious reasons. You worry about the minister or someone coming down and saying, well, right, that's it, 20% budget cut next year. So this is a real challenge. And it's not unique to research funding. There's a broader issue about our willingness to take risk and to fail publicly in all sorts of areas of public policy and public life. But it is a challenge for this field, and I don't downplay the significance of that as an inhibitor. It's not simply a matter of will or money. It's also often, I think, a sensible sort of self-defense mechanism by some funders not to want to do too much of this stuff in a public way, or to keep it in the realm of very tightly circumscribed evaluations that you farm out to consultancies, and you can kind of, in a sense, control the message a bit more. I understand why that happens a lot. I don't think that's a route towards getting the kind of evidence that we actually need, but we need to build that case.
Thank you, Arian. In terms of your experience with the talent program and other kind of experimentation, is there anything that you'd like to build off of James' comments?
When looking at, well, we started half a year ago with a program within the Dutch Research Council on better structuring our data. So we are sitting on a bunch of data, of course, from years and years, but it's not easy to access it. So we have a project, and we have a chief information officer now, and a big program. So I think it will be better, and that makes it for us easier as well to do research on our research policy, also on the talent scheme. So yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment. And okay, I it's but it's when I was looking at the question from I think Holiday, what proportion of national funding agency require grantees to report back on the accomplishment achieved from previous what? That's a very valuable question as well. And that's also something we always say. We are very strict at the entrance. So when you receive your funding, it's very hard to receive funding. There's low success rate, and then you have it, and then afterwards we don't ask anything anymore. So that's a pity. That can be better also for the talent scheme, but also for your data, and also when you want to work evidence based. What will be done with it? Yeah.
Thank you. Shirley, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yep.
One last question, and I do have a final question to pose to all three of you at the end. Arian, you did talk about Cody Day's question here around the proportion of national funders requiring grantees to report back on accomplishments achieved from previous awards. I will just take a very quick moment to say I think this is a very important, something that we can all be doing either differently or better or both. And in the Canadian context, I know it varies from agency to agency and program to program. So, and the type of information and the depth of information varies quite substantially. So this is something that I know internally we are having discussions around, and I think it's a great point to raise. Does anyone have anything further to raise with regards to his question here around what, I guess, the proportion of grantees, but the notion of reporting back on accomplishments, the value add to that? James.
Well, just a very quick thing to add. I do think that it's a shame that in some contexts grant holders do report back and are required to report back through various systems. I mean, I think of ResearchFish as a dominant system here in the UK and obviously in a number of funding contexts, but you don't get anything back from it. You don't really see, as a researcher, you don't see the effects, nor, I know they're working on this, it's not just single out researchers, but nor in general often do you get to sort of see the benefits, as it were, of the aggregation of that data in pursuit of answers to some of these questions. In a sense, it does just go into a bit of a void, and it feels like, I mean, I've been speaking as a grant holder, as it were, more than an analyst of research fund. It feels like you're just sort of producing this stuff to tick boxes and sort of throw it into a kind of the gaping maw of some system and never knowing what comes of it. And I think that is really problematic, because if we're trying to build up, what we should be aiming for is a stronger system of collective intelligence about what's happening in our funding system. And our greatest asset in that process is not the funders, it's not government, it's the researchers themselves, and getting them alongside in this task, and the capturing of impacts is part of that, of course. And you know, we do see researchers' willingness to do that in other contexts, you know, but and often through commercial platforms, meaning ResearchGate, academia, you know, things that are, you know, have kind of have stepped in, as it were, and created stupid proxies for impact, like, you know, your ResearchGate score, whatever, you know, I mean, which doesn't really mean anything. But I think that's the sort of direction to go in, and I hope that systems, you know, that are in place or that can be developed can do more of that.
Thank you. Shirley or Arian, any question or response to that? Excellent. Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left of this panel, and I would like to ask one final question to the panelists before we wrap up. I mentioned at the start of our panel that the Powering Discovery report has been an important part of NSERC's reflections for our next strategic plan that we're entitling NSERC 2030. We've covered many interesting and important topics here today, and I'd like to end with a question to you. Knowing the state of evidence on the funding practices for funding natural and engineering research, what do you advise NSERC as a bold direction that we can take our strategic plan? Shirley, as the person who chaired that report, I'm going to pass it to you to kick us off.
Well, I've been thinking about this question, Danica, and I'd like to raise a science policy issue that I think is critical. Certainly, I know it's critical in Canada. I know it's critical in the U.S. and in the U.K. As well. And that is, I think we need to really consider the structure of the workforce. It's one of the reasons why I like the segmented career awards, because it is a way for funding agencies to take some responsibility for the structure of the workforce. And if I had one thing that I would like to see a greater use of professional scientists conducting science and being funded appropriately by funding agencies, as opposed to the system that currently exists today, where the vast majority of the labor is conducted by trainees who are being produced in numbers that the system cannot then absorb. And much of the tension in the system today is because of this dilemma of the overproduction of people with expectations of having careers not unlike their advisors, when the expectation can never be met today. It just simply cannot. So I think some of the resistance to the change in the structure of the workforce has to do with money. Everything has to do with money, but it has to do also with the way in which funding agencies think about funding personnel in science. And the fact that they can fund a graduate student for a whole lot less than they can fund a professional scientist is what drives the system that we currently have. So if I have one thing I'd like to see change, I would like to see a greater involvement in the funding agencies in pushing the scientific community to rebalancing its workforce.
Thank you so much. That is very, very helpful to hear from you. I will move over to Arian next for your advice.
Okay, thank you, Danica. Yeah, I have more a suggestion just to do some experiment with, and that's we started at the Dutch Research Council in our open competition, the scheme for the free competition, with without deadlines. So and when looking at pressure in the system, and what we see is that we have less proposals then. So people don't feel the pressure from, tomorrow it's the 1st of September. So we all, we have to, to apply. And it's less tension there. That it's a little bit more relaxed. So people are only submitting their proposal when it's finished. And at first there were a lot of complainers. Well, that this will not help anything here because we will still have the same amount of proposals. But that's not true. It really reduces proposals from. I think when we look at our open competition now at the moment, I think it's about the 25% less. So in combination, what Shirley suggests, I think this will be helpful as well. We are going to do it in our talent scheme as well, I think. So it's
So more to come on that. We'll look for you to see how that one rolls out as well. Thank you so much. James, last.
Thanks. Yes, well, I've read with interest the discussion paper before the session, and I mean, I think it's great. I mean, you're asking all the right questions, and it's brilliant to see these kinds of issues, taking a very prominent position in your overall strategic reflections. My hope would be that in developing a new strategy, you can build and sort of win the case with your stakeholders, in the Canadian system and government and elsewhere to position NSERC and indeed the wider Canadian funding system, because of course there's lots of great stuff also going on at CIHR and SSHRC, and I mean, to really sort of build the case for Canada as a system that is committed to evidence-informed research policy and funding, and wants to build a funding community that's at the forefront of these methods. So I think beyond that sort of commitment, there's then obviously questions about how you do that, how you put in place internal capacity and resources, how you also support the efforts in the wider community. I do think a distributed model is the best way of doing it, in that trying to sort of hoard it all and do it inside one place is not the best way of tapping into the potential that's out there, as I say, for the more collective intelligence that exists in the system to be harnessed to these ends. I think as long as one can navigate the political challenges, but at least you've just gone through an election, so hopefully you have a degree of stability for a while. As long as you can navigate that, then I think that's the real sweet spot. And obviously, it would be great to see more of those connections with other. No, it's good. It's great to see.
Oh, thank you. So 2 minutes to go in our session, and so I will call the discussion to a close. I'd really like to extend my thanks to all of you for this great discussion, and to everybody here watching today for their great questions and chat comments. Please make sure to visit the NSERC 2030 webpage, where you'll find the discussion papers we've been referring to and an opportunity to contribute your thoughts into our strategic planning. We very much appreciate your input into this process. Once again, thank you all for your participation, and wishing everybody a really good rest of your conference. Thank you so much. Bonne journée.
Thank you.